Hey everybody, hope you're all doing good. Just Elijah and I are loading up. We're gonna head down and see my dad in Joplin today. So had a little bit of time. I wanted to put out another video on the jig series I'm talking about doing. And I'm gonna be doing, like I said, over the next several months, I'm gonna be doing a lot of jig and jerk bait tips, sort of advice on it. And with the jig fishing, you know, I'm gonna do some stuff as far as showing you specifically with the jigs, as far as doing some videos to show you, different type of ways to trim skirts and tying jigs and stuff like that, some actual how-to stuff. But today, on the trip down there, I just got a little bit of time. I wanted to discuss really what, in my opinion, is the biggest myth or misunderstanding or mistake that anglers have about jig fishing. Probably the biggest mistake that they can make on it, and that has to do with the weight of the jig you're using. Now, when we're talking about jigs here, I really sort of divide jigs up into three different categories. Would be the football head jigs, that type of stuff, swing head jigs, the flipping jigs, and your finesse jigs or your casting jigs. A lot of times I'll probably group a finesse jig and a casting jig sort of in the same category, because a lot of times you're dealing with a smaller profile jig, a little bit lighter wire hook. All those flipping jigs, finesse jigs, can come in a flipping hook variety. But for the most part, I want to address the two different jig styles, which would be the flipping jigs and the casting or the finesse jigs as far as weight goes. Also, we'll get in, there's a different category for swim jigs and the football head jigs too. But anyway, back to the main thing. The biggest mistake people make that I see in jig fishing is they don't really have an understanding of how important the weight size is on your jig. Because the weight of your jig, it has so much to do. It has a lot to do with the efficiency that you have using the bait. The fall rate has a lot to do with generating a strike. And there's a lot of different aspects to that, because I think one of the things I see a lot of people get locked into is they get locked into just using one or two different jig sizes, and most people use jig sizes that are way too heavy. You'll see a lot of people use a half-ounce jig, 3/4 ounce jig, 1 ounce jig, that type of stuff. But in my jig fishing arsenal, I have everything from a 1/8 ounce jig head all the way up to an ounce. I've got 1/8, I've got 3/16, I've got quarter, I've got half ounce, I've got 5/8, I've got 3/4, I've got 1 ounce, and some of those weight variations, they're not real specific, because different jigs, they don't all weigh the same based upon the head design, whether it's a ball head or some type of another flipping type style head. But anyway, the sizes on it I use vary tremendously. And also, one of the things you have to remember when you're dealing with jig sizes is, the line size that you're using and the trailers that you're using will also greatly affect, the fall rate of that jig too. So there's a lot of different variables here. You have the actual weight of the jig, you have maybe the skirt composition, how thick, how full, or how sparse the skirt is, combined with the type of trailer, how much drag that trailer creates, and your line size, which also creates drag. But here's the main thing that people get caught up in, is that you have to use the size of jig that I'm not necessarily that worried about efficiency and being able to put that jig where I want to be easily. I'm wanting to basically select my jig size based upon what I feel is going to generate the strike from the bass. And in doing so, that's why I have so many different sizes on there. For example, let me start with the lighter sizes and work out just sort of basically some different conditions. one of the things I found about jig fishing is it's not necessarily about the water temperature as much as it is the water clarity, because a lot of people, they have this go-to philosophy that, okay, if the water's cold, I need to use a slower falling jig and downsize and that type of stuff, and as the water gets warmer, I need to go to a heavier jig to get a reaction strike. And that's not always the case. It can be sometimes, but most of the time I found that not to be true. In my own personal jig fishing, which I fish jigs a lot, and I have fished tons and tons of jigs for 40 plus years, I found out that water visibility to me dictates the size and fall rate that I want over anything else, including water temperature. And so, for example, what I have with that, if I'm fishing, say I'm fishing stumps and laydowns, and the water's muddy, the water's like, say, 3 to 6 inches visibility, maybe not even 6 inches, 3 or 4 inches visibility, which is about the lower end of the visibility I like to fish on any place. And the water is shallow, say that water, is just a couple feet deep. I'm always using a light jig, like an 1/8 ounce or 1/4 ounce jig. I don't care if the water temperature is 40 degrees or if it's 90 degrees. I just get a lot more bites in that. Now, conversely, if the water clarity is really clear, and I'm fishing, deeper cover, and that's another thing, is like, along with the water clarity, the water depth has a lot to do with it too. Generally, for the most part, the shallower the water is, the lighter the jigs I like to use, and the heavier jigs on the deeper water. But conversely to that 1/8 ounce scenario, if I'm in a situation, say, where I've got 5 or 6 foot of visibility, say the water's flooded out, Table Rock Lake, clear water, and I'm fishing, heavy cover in that clear water, that's when I'm going up to the heavy jigs. I'm going up to the 3/4 ounce, 1 ounce jigs. Regardless, again, if the water temperature is 50 degrees or 90 degrees. Simply doing so is not only that you have the efficiency factor, which is not my big consideration, but it's just a matter of a strike generator. It's just like I get a lot more bites in cold water or warm water if it's clear and I'm using a heavier weight. I'll use an example. Excuse me. We were fishing an FLW tournament at Sam Rayburn a couple of years ago, February. Water temperature was cold. It was real cold, and I was flipping bushes. Water was way high, maybe 8 or 9 foot in the bushes. Water temperature was cold, and I was catching all of my fish flipping a 3/4 and 1 ounce jig. Those fish were sitting on the bottom. They would bite the bait sometimes on the way down, maybe 25% of the time, but a lot of times they'd hit it on the bottom after the first couple hops. And I tried some lighter stuff like 1/2 ounce and stuff like that, and I couldn't get bit. So anyway, that I always use the heavier jigs in the clear water, lighter jigs in the dirty water, and those are two extremes. But what I'm trying to do is I'm mixing that up in different scenarios for different weights. Say, for example, I've still got the option of using 3/8, 1/4 ounce, 1/2 ounce, that type of stuff. And what I'm doing with that, it all has to do, again, with the water clarity that I'm fishing and the type of cover that I'm fishing. And a lot of it is just experiment with that. It's like anything else, particularly like with the jigs and jerk baits are the two biggest bait categories that I realize that there's so many variables to, as far as colors and weights and profiles and that type of stuff. So second to the jig size, we're talking about, okay, you've got the two extremes I'm talking about, and then you've got the in-between variables, which you can sort of fill that in yourself, what that would be. But second to that is the jig trailers that you're using, because if you're using a jig trailer like with some big flappers on it, like a Rage Cross, something like that, it's going to fall a lot slower than if you're using something like a Zoom Super Chunk Junior that's got just straight legs with no drag on it. So a lot of times, you might be able to get away with a heavier jig if you're using that those flapping legs and slow the fall down on it. And on top of that, if you're using heavier line, that's also going to be a factor in slowing the fall rate down on the jigs. Because when I'm jig fishing, unless I'm fishing a finesse jig in clear water, I like heavy fluorocarbon line. I don't like using braided line unless I absolutely have to. Most of the time I'm flipping 20 to 30 pound test fluorocarbon. And when you're using 20 to 30 pound test fluorocarbon, it will slow the fall of that jig down considerably versus using 10 or 12 pound test line. So all this comes into play together. The exact head size of your bait, the line size you're using, and the type of trailer. So that's just something that you sort of have to get a feel for yourself on what that how that's going to be. But anyway, like I said, the biggest mistake that I see people making back going back to the topic of this conversation is they don't use enough different jig sizes. They don't understand the fall rate of the jig, and they tend to just use a handful of different weights. So the advice I want to leave everybody with is that don't get locked into using a 1/2 ounce, 3/4, 5/8, and 1 ounce jig. Vary them down a little bit. Go all the way to 8/4, 3/8. Change it up a little bit, and let the water clarity decide the weight of jig you're using over anything else. This whole thing about the bass's metabolism are faster in the summertime, and that's why you got to use the heavy jigs. There may be a little bit of truth to that, but I found that is just not the case in the way that I fish. Some of the best jig fishing days I've ever had in my life have been in the heat of the summer, in dirty water, around shallow cover, with like a 1/4 ounce jig in that shallow cover. It just all has to do with figuring out what's going to generate the strike from that bass, and that it's not as simple as using a light jig in cold water and a heavy jig in warm water. It just doesn't work that way. It'd be great if it did. It would be great if it did. It would make life a lot simpler, but that's just not the case for me. So that's what I want to leave you with today. Don't let water temperature dictate your jig sizes. Don't get locked into jig sizes. Let the water visibility be your main factor, and experiment with different jig sizes. And in doing so, like I said, I think you'll get a lot more bites. But anyway, jig fishing has got a ton of variables. Like I said, in this series that I'm going to do, the next one I'm going to do, it's going to be all about trailers and line and different skirt, the amount of material in different skirts and how that affects the fall rate and everything. Different ways to tie a jig, whether you have a bushy collar on it or a flat one. There's just a lot of stuff going on with that. Like I said, I think that jig fishing is the second most complicated technique out there behind jerkbait fishing as far as getting the most out of it. Anyway, just a few tips today. Hope everybody's doing good today, and we'll check in later with another one. See you.